Jr., Senior Vice President and Executive Editor at Black Enterprise. Please welcome to the show the CEO of USA Track and Field, the owner of Rev Racing, Max Siegel.
Well, thank you so much. This is a full circle moment for me being here with you today.
I remember when you first started, you were working for Dale Earnhardt as a global leader at Dale Earnhardt, a legendary NASCAR, obviously, icon. And that was already a big deal to us, obviously. That was a barrier breaker in so many ways. But you were talking to me about what the possibilities were for NASCAR and the diversity. And you know, again, back in those days, 30 years ago, it was seen as a Southern sport and a sport for white males, to some degree white women, but white males. I want to start off with what that I think was the common thread of much of your career as you talk about your journey to who you are professionally. To me, you specialize in looking at spaces where people didn't see money and opportunity. So let's talk about gospel music. People say, oh yeah, you need it, it's good, but it's not where you go to build a great business. You go to R&B, you go to pop, you go to, but not gospel and not jazz, but definitely not gospel. And of course, the two sports that you're most connected with today, which is NASCAR and USA Track and Field, were also sports that were like, well, you only pay attention to that. USA Track and Field is the Olympics coming, and it's not where you go to make money as an athlete or as an entrepreneur, as an executive. And of course, NASCAR, which obviously was always a profitable sport, but it was seen as more kind of a regional, limited sport with limited appeal. You went to all three of those types of spaces, and I'd like you to talk about your career to this point in that context, looking where other people weren't looking, to say, no, there is much more potential here beyond the credibility of the sport or the art than people can see. Talk about that, and I don't know if that was what you were thinking when you came out of Notre Dame Law, or that just became an emerging theme of your career.
Yeah, I think that I tell people all the time, it makes all the sense when I look back, but I really did not have a strategy, and if I could do anything all over again, it would be more intentional about where I wanted to go. But for me, having cultural impact, you know, ministry has always been a big part of everything that I did, and my clients early on actually taught me things that I didn't realize I was learning. So, you know, from the very beginning, my first music client was John P. Key, who was a family friend, and it was at a time when I met him, all he talked about was his ministry and the impact he wanted to have on young people and how he wanted to grow his church. And then I got the opportunity to represent him in his recording contract. And it was during that time I saw that how powerful his music had an impact on culture. And I said to him, if we could get the same kind of resources to back your music that they do in R&B and jazz and everything else, I think that it would resonate and we would sell a lot of records. And to your point, it was hard to balance ministry and commercial art. Yes. Right, and so the first record that we did with Zomba, which is Jive Records in 1994, Show Up, sold 500,000 copies. And it was at that point in time, I think the biggest selling gospel record at the time was probably 60,000 units. The light bulb went on that you can marry those two concepts. You can do good, you can do the right thing, you can have integrity in your ministry, but it can be commercially successful. And so that started me on this kind of journey of being fascinated with giving people who had a powerful message a platform to really spread that word.
So again, we could do a whole show just on that. Let's talk about your journey. You were the first African American to graduate with honors from Notre Dame Law. What was your thinking about what your path was going to be from that, and even your path to that?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family, divorced parents, a lot of drugs and alcohol, no college. And so for me, my younger sister and I being in this chaotic, dysfunctional environment, I just wanted a better life, being stable. So, you know, I paid a lot of attention and I spent time in school and sports. And frankly, I worked too because I needed any excuse to not go home. That afforded me the opportunity to go to Notre Dame, which I struggled as an undergrad. Took a little time off to work while I was figuring it all out. And then I realized the law, people, solving problems were fascinating to me. And by the time I went back to law school, I was committed to not getting through it, but I wanted to be a really great lawyer. So I went to law school and I treated it like a job. You know, I had worked, got up in the morning, was incredibly disciplined. And one of my best friends from law school, Kevin Warren, who's the CEO of the Chicago Bears, was a little ahead of me. And Kevin kind of taught me the game. You know, it's not about just the substance, but how do you write your exams? You know, how do you study for them? How do you understand the culture of Notre Dame Law School? And I give him a lot of credit, as well as my law school roommate, Mickey Carter, for being that support network. And so it was ironic because at the time I was in Indiana, and my class was the last class that could still sit for the bar while you were a third-year law student. So in the span of a week, grading is anonymous in law school. Between my last final and graduation, I found out that I had passed the bar, which was life-changing, and then I was the first African-American to graduate from law school with honors. And to me, it was really the first time that I felt confidence that no matter where you come from, if you had it in you and you put the work in, that you can compete with some of the greatest minds in the world. I was in law school with sons and daughters of judges and business leaders and doctors, and so it also opened up those opportunities for me to get clerkships at prestigious firms and opportunities that led the way to how I started my career.
I'm from the generation of black people, and black men in particular, that the only wealth we saw in sports was if you could play, if you could perform on the fields, on the courts, whatever. And I will tell you, you are the first person I met shortly after I got to Black Enterprise that first kind of turned on the light bulb to me that there's a business of sports, and there's careers, and there's opportunities and entrepreneurship, and there's nothing wrong with being gifted as an athlete and building wealth and having a lifestyle driven by your ability to perform. But that was such a small part of the possibilities. But what does it mean to be one of the early examples of what it meant to be in the business of sports as opposed to a performer or a worker in sports?
It was a tremendous responsibility and an honor, frankly. And so for me, the light bulb went on because my father was in the music business and my mother was in the music business. My father was an executive, my mother was an artist. And so I kind of got a little exposure to the business side of sport. But what was so fascinating to me, I like to figure things out. And, I realized the resources it took, whether you were training to be an athlete or you were making a record and all the marketing that went into it. And then I took a look at it and I said, when I looked at so many people in music and sports, it's kind of like a unifier, right? And but there's this huge economic engine. Concerts are sold out. People go to sporting events. Reggie White, who was my client, one of my best friends, was the first one to introduce me to the business of NASCAR. And I went to the Daytona 500. You have 300,000 people, but I was fascinated coming from General Motors. What was going on with the car parts and what was going on with the tires and what was going on with the logistics to move these people around. And so for me, fortunately, my first job out of law school, my mentor said, before you get involved in the sport or the entertainment side of the industry, I want you to be one of the best lawyers out there. So, I was trained in both intellectual property and general business law. And he basically told me, if you want to have value and you want to sustain a long career, you have to be that one that brings some kind of value to the business and understand that there is a business of sports, there is a business of entertainment. And so even now I try to encourage young professionals to come up with that skill set that really contributes to the sustainability of a business.
So, today, I think we look back and we see, whether it's Magic Johnson or Michael Jordan, who maybe you'll talk a little bit about later, the athletes going on to becoming successful entrepreneurs, the late Junior Bridgman, or going on to manage. It's not really a big deal, but back in those days, that's not the way we thought. So, what do you think it says for the business of sport? And I think you touched on it in terms of the opportunities that are perceived now that we didn't necessarily perceive.
Yeah, there are tremendous opportunities. And I think what's fascinating is culturally and from a technological, technology's changed all of this. I think that at some point, when you start talking about diversification, now the DEI conversation is kind of taboo. But the reality is, to run a successful business, you need to reach as many people as possible. And what I found out, and I'm kind of digressing a bit, is that USA Track and Field, we're the most diverse national governing body in the Olympic space. We've had the most financial success, historic medal count, 34 medals in Paris, just historic deals, and I attribute it to having a diverse staff. and I have people from all walks of life with different perspectives. If I want to reach a customer, like now, if I want to go younger, my demographic, as cool as I think I might be, I need to engage with people who live in that world. So for me, it's really been a business driver to look out and say, hey, how can I add to my team so we have the most well-rounded perspective on things? And so when you start to look at sport, they're every single discipline. My wife's a pediatric dentist. We have dentists and doctors and marketers and engineers and sports scientists, all within the sporting context. And that's the machine behind what the fans see on a weekly basis. Tremendous opportunities, and again, I would encourage someone to have a skill set, because I think those hard skills are transferable regardless of the industry.
So let's stick with track and field, USA Track and Field in particular, and what we've been experiencing certainly over the last 20 years. Two things. One you already touched upon. When you look at track and field and the broader sport of whether it's gymnastics or skiing, you're looking at teams from countries, and they're all diverse. Like, you used to be able to say, oh, you can tell that's the French team because they're all white French people on the team. Now, every country is diversified because really to compete on a global level, you got to be able to draw talent from wherever it is. And so what strikes me about your leadership, and I want you to talk about that, of USA Track and Field, is this was a sport that kind of had a natural diversity to it, but wasn't necessarily seen as a great space for building business, building careers. Talk about your leadership of USA Track and Field, as well as what now we're seeing professionalism in track and field, in particular, exploding in a way that we wouldn't have predicted 20 years ago.
Yeah, so what's fascinating to me was I was recruited to be an independent board member before I took over as a CEO. And having been in the Olympic space, I was fascinated with the athletes, but to your point, the business is pretty stagnant. And I wondered why, because it's a global platform. And the magnitude of the business hit me within the first 2 weeks of my job. So World Athletics is our global governing body for 214 countries. The 100-year anniversary happened, and I was a CEO, and my board said, you have to go represent the United States. Much like many consumers, I paid attention during the Olympic years, and our headquarters is in Monaco. So I got on the plane not knowing what I was getting myself into. I landed in Nice, France. I had members of the military pull me off the plane, put me on a helicopter, go over to Monaco in a motorcade to the palace, and I'm literally sitting next to Prince Albert with parents who didn't go to college. I went to public school, and I was just blown away. But the reverence that the world had with our athletes, and to see, government leadership, ministers of sport, prime ministers, presidents of countries, all coming together around the sporting event, but they talked about policy and culture. During the Olympic Games, when it was the big Black Lives Matter movement here, it was about human rights, global human rights and dignity. And so it was really fascinating to me, again, to see that cultural impact. Well, when you leave the United States, even though most people don't even know what we do here, you'll go to stadiums, whether it's in Budapest or London, that have 100,000 fans at a track and field event. And when you look at countries, think about it, when you don't have a stick and ball sport, the heroes that inspire the next generation of leaders, the young athletes, are Olympic athletes. And so for me, I felt like we could bring in commercial partners that understood that. And I leaned in heavily on the relationships that I had built with partners in NASCAR to take a chance in the space. And then, we also have had the benefit of a long-term partnership with Nike. So to be able to go to the founder, Phil Knight, who created his entire empire of being a track and field athlete. And we did a deal for a $500 million that really solidified and stabilized that organization and gave us a bigger profile. So again, I travel around the world for work. I see the kids that engage in it at a young age, and there's so many benefits that come from it. And I think right now what we're starting to see is the professionalism, is the profile of the sport growing. And then you'll see various high-profile events that are televised, in the off years. So I'm pretty excited about the trajectory, and really having the Olympic Games here in the States in 28 has really made a lot of people pay closer attention.
I want to stick on that point of connecting the professionalism and I'll say professional opportunities for athletes, and how that drives the revenue potential of a sport and vice versa. So I'd like you to kind of talk about how there's a direct connection to athletic achievement, because to really get athletes or people to commit to it as a career requires there to be a perception of opportunity. And we're seeing some record-breaking performance in all these sports, in part because the resources are there, and there's a cost-benefit analysis to, hey, maybe I will extend my athletic career before I go get my master's degree or go to medical school, because my career horizon is a lot longer. Am I being fair in terms of how that affects the financial potential of a given sport?
Yeah, you know, my kids are at an age, and I'm at an age where I start to reflect on what my why is. Like, why do I do this every day? And I am so encouraged when you look at investors like Alexis Ohanian, Serena's husband, who really is doubling down to say, hey, these athletes, and starting with female athletes, deserve an opportunity, but brings a business discipline and a focus to that investment to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're putting a great product on it, we can pay the athletes, and we get a financial return. As a governing body, we have an interesting, you know, we got to be all things, all people. We train our athletes, you know, we are at the grassroots, we have to be the commercial engine of it. And so I love the fact that, you know, when I look back on my body of work, which I say was mostly accidental, we've been able to be a catalyst and a validator to bring someone in there and say, hey, take a risk, invest in these athletes, and there'll be a return. And so, you know, as the economics grow and people are paying more attention, I'm excited about the fact that now we can go tell that story to young athletes that you can pursue this on the athletic side and you can earn money. And at the same time, you know, we have a whole production team that does our live production with NBC as our network. And there's a whole nother skill set and opportunities for professionals. So I'm really encouraged.
And that professionalism, I'm seeing this across all sports really. It used to be the athlete was the athlete, then they stopped being an athlete and they went away, they did something else. But there wasn't a real roadway for them to transition that into executive careers in their respective sports. And now you're seeing so many former athletes, both pro and college, who go on to be executives in a way that I don't think we saw before.
Let me say, one of the proudest things I think myself and my COO, Renee Washington, in USA Track and Field, we have 6 Olympians on our staff that are executives. I believe that's probably the most in the Olympic space, but we were committed to, you know, you often hear, well, you don't have any work experience. So I'm convinced none of us are born with experience, but we have to be really intentional. So, you know, bunch of different disciplines with our executives, you know, a director of youth, we have a general manager of high performance, you know, across the disciplines within USA Track and Field, we are also saying to athletes, while you have that platform, now's the time to start networking and thinking about what happens after competition. It may be a difficult conversation to have, but they bring the discipline, the characteristics, the expertise that would be a benefit to companies in the sport. So we've been trying to walk the walk at USA Track and Field.
So USA Track and Field, $500 million in revenue, which again, to my mind, given the history of you don't do track and field to make money, you do that for fun and for personal achievement. Then you go on to a real career. What does that mean to even put that kind of a number next to the sport for just USA Track and Field? And what's the potential upside even beyond where we are?
Yeah, there's tremendous upside. I'll start there. What it means is that at a base level, we're able to support athletes in terms of both their training. You know, there's direct economic support, but medical, science, you know, the logistics of transportation, making sure that our coaches, our personal coaches, are with their athletes and those kind of things. But what's really interesting about the upside that people overlook, the event for us that probably has the most economic impact is our Junior Olympics and our youth. So we went to Savannah. The event over a course of 6 days had a $25 million economic impact on that community. 8,000 athletes and their families enjoying the experience and just being there. And so for me, part of the untapped potential, which we're seeing in youth sports, is really from a business side, organizing great experiences for young people. And for us, it's our athletic pipeline, it's our future fans. So when you look at all the different properties, you see the most high-profile things on the Olympics. But you got a whole track and field is the highest participatory sport for boys and girls in middle school and high school. And then in this country there are 45 million people that are self-proclaimed runners. So there is a lot of economic potential. I think harnessing that, the industry has been fragmented, but really putting together some kind of infrastructure and cohesiveness, I think we can unlock a lot of the economic potential.
At the grassroots, we talk about, how easy it is to get into basketball because you just need a hoop and a ball and a place to play. But even more accessible, when you're a kid, you can run from here to there and see who can run the fastest. I mean, we had Olympics in my neighborhood just getting from telephone pole to telephone pole or jumping over ropes, who could jump the highest. And that's a tremendous, grounds for the early raw talent. But what you're doing as CEO of USA Track and Field is now at the top of the sport, building capacity, building opportunity, so that grassroots talent, and that you said the Junior Olympics, actually manifests itself into the ultimate global product.
I'll tell you, in NASCAR and track and field, it's about speed, but it's a direct contrast because the access to the opportunities in NASCAR is just so it's so daunting that it's hard. And so to me, I live this kind of like schizophrenic life when I'm really trying to, make a sport that anyone can do popular, and at the same time create those access points for people who couldn't really even get into motorsports. It's a fascinating juxtaposition, really.
Perfect transition to again, I already talked about our "I told you so" moment. So I was like, "Yeah, Max, good luck with that." But I'm not going to, I'm not going to a NASCAR race. But let me start out, with what you said earlier in this conversation. In every sport, certainly in the late 20th century, and it went from only certain people get to do this, and a certain amount of success, a certain amount of profit and revenue potential. Then the switch would be you diversify the sport, which diversifies the fan base, and suddenly the floodgates of potential revenue opportunity opens up. We saw it with Jackie Robinson. People don't know there was a time when black people didn't get to play pro basketball. It's mind-boggling. So I want you to kind of go into the beginning of Drive for Diversity after you work with Dale Earnhardt's company, and talk about that understanding of, yes, people think of it as a Southern white male kind of thing, and it doesn't have much potential beyond that. Obviously, the France families began to see beyond that. I want you to talk about that. But talk about this transition from diversifying a sport, leading to a bigger fan base, which leads to more revenue and growth, and now we're talking about even global.
Yeah, so I was like you. So in terms of my skepticism, I grew up in Indianapolis, didn't really have, I grew up a mile from the Speedway, right, and didn't have a lot of access to that. And so as I represented Reggie White and he sunset his career in North Carolina and became close to Joe Gibbs, he said to me, I want you to be my partner. There are a lot of opportunities for women and people of color in NASCAR. I'm like, you're crazy. My father was Jewish, I'm black, and there are no opportunities for women and people of color in NASCAR. And so he encouraged me to get involved, and we formed a group before we unfortunately lost him. And so I stayed in New York City, and I had met all these owners when we were looking to buy a team. And I got a call this is a true story, I got a call from a search firm. A friend of mine who was a friend of someone conducting a search for the president of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. And the senior partner of that firm did not want to send me down to interview because I was black. And it was a historic brand, and there's no way that he'd ever get hired for the job. So the junior partner took a risk and sent me down there. And as I sat down with Teresa Earnhardt, what she was fascinated about was I was in the entertainment business. So she was about marketing, the brand, the legacy. She wanted to produce a movie. And so it was insane because we had this connection, and she hired me to come down there. I believe I was probably the first person of color in that organization. And to come from the music business as a black president in NASCAR was just crazy. So when I got there, what I was fascinated about was she had tapped into how to grow it from just being on the racetrack to monetizing all these intellectual property rights. The other thing that was really interesting for me and how I got into the Drive for Diversity space was it actually was not about race. It was about legacy. There were many Earnhardts that worked in that company. My great-grandfather was in it. My grandfather was in it. And so it was just a natural progression. You grew up in racing. And we didn't even have the awareness of the opportunities or the access. On top of that, when Richard Childress and Teresa and I worked on Dale the Movie, which was a hugely successful entertainment property, they started talking, and I realized that what they were all about was excellence, resources, and if you could go fast and bring in more money, it didn't matter what color you were. You know what I mean? You were contributing to the business. So Reggie White, Brad Doherty, a lot of folks early on worked with Brian France about the Drive for Diversity program, and I saw that the structure was not proper, right? And Rick Hendrick asked me, he said, listen, do you think you could help us with this diversity initiative? And so as I studied it for a year, what I realized was that you had to be a team owner because you had to be the one that would open up the door and let people in. And you had to have some structure and the resources behind these young, talented drivers to demonstrate that they were capable. And I'll give you two crazy examples on both ends of the spectrum. But the other thing was you have to have industry credibility. So I started at the grassroots level with a development team because there was if I went in initially as a Sprint Cup owner and I'm not Michael Jordan, then no one would take it serious. We had to win on the weekly series. We had many drivers go through that, but one of our early successes was Bubba Wallace. I mean, he drove for me when he was like 14 years old, right? And the fact of the matter was this kid was incredibly talented, needed a platform, great equipment. He was our first win in the sport. And then everyone in there, then we went on to bring Kyle Larson in, who's two-time Sprint Cup champion, but we won a championship with him. And I think people started to believe that it was about the support. So the byproduct of that is that now you start to have more people that look like them interested in checking it out.
Let me tell our audience, that may have been where it started, the idea, but how far that has gone for NASCAR as a sport beyond women with people of color in terms of the broad diversification in the truest sense of the word. So NASCAR did $1.7 billion in the 2024-2025 season. We're talking about a New Zealand driver winning 2 Chicago street races, SVG, who I became a fan of. I spent most of 2023 into 2024 going to NASCAR races. This is so foreign from how I reacted the first time. I am a hardcore NASCAR fan because I got to experience it from the inside. And I'm talking about, I did a whole series of interviews for Black Enterprise around the 20th anniversary of the Drive for Diversity. Interviewed Brandon Thompson, who's the VP of Diversity.
So by the way,
yeah.
Brandon worked for me at Rev Racing.
Well, he told me.
Yeah,
he told me.
And I'm going to tell you this.
Yeah.
So to me, I get more excited about that, right?
Yeah.
From the pit crew members to the executive
Well, I'm talking about Brianna. It started out,
Yeah.
when I interviewed Brandon and others in NASCAR, like they said we thought it was about getting more drivers in the cars. And what they discovered was, just like in any sport, that it's just, you can't just slot drivers into cars. It's a very, very hard sport to do, and to work your way up to that level. Then they realized, no, it's not just about drivers and cars. And now today, you have Latasha Causey, who's the second woman, the first African-American woman of president of Phoenix Raceway. You got executives like Eric Ryan, who's now chief communications officer. And so I'm saying, my eyes were so open when you see everywhere you looked, there were women and people of color throughout the organization, but a light switch went on that said, you diversify the organization, and then that creates the opportunity, the perception opportunities, the pathways for drivers like Bubba Wallace or Roger Carruth, and I think Destiny Spurlock is kind of coming up the ranks as a black female athlete in the sport. So I'm fascinated about this idea that what we thought back in the day, even you as someone who at the beginning, now it's a legitimately nationally appealing, huge fan base going to these races. People are of all backgrounds are at these races. Chicago Street Race was amazing. And it just brings back that this $1.x billion is tied to your earlier premise that if you diversify the opportunities, I'm really going beyond race, just make it a sport that everybody can connect to. Who doesn't like fast cars? Us not liking NASCAR was not about not liking driving fast cars or watching cars drive fast. So I mean, I'm trying to kind of wrap it up in a nutshell how much bigger and broader this became than just can we get more Wendell Scotts into cars.
It's interesting, even our journey in friendship is that you have to stay after it. People wanted instantaneous success, right? It's about incremental success, one person at a time. But one of the things that I really tried to do was I wanted to go find just friends and fans, but also influencers and tastemakers that would make it okay for other people to try it. So to hear, I'm just tickled pink to hear you following the sport now, from the beginning, but it was really, there was a huge perception problem, for people to just even try it. But then, we got to celebrate, this organization that you represent right now for also highlighting and promoting and making people aware. And I, Jashawn Hamilton, Brandon Thompson, I go down the whole list of people that, listen, I was on the college tour when Brandon was managing the college tour. My mother-in-law was over development at Morehouse, and we had trouble getting young people to even come to the panels, but then all of a sudden, Brandon's a Clark, graduate. And people are like, wow, one of my, he's my frat brother, one of my fraternity brothers is in NASCAR, and so to me, I think it's been really cool for me to see the engagement. But to your point, on the other side of that, we spend money too. So when we go to the track, and you're buying tickets and you're buying the merchandise and you're having an economic impact, then it's great. The fascinating thing for me from a sponsorship standpoint was I had to figure this out. As we try to diversify the athletes on the track, it was a difficult sell because the sponsors already had 75 million white fans. So what is your talented driver? How are they going to connect our brand to an audience that we don't really have? And so, that has, changed tremendously. And I got to say this, I would like to think, Michael Jordan's first driver was Bubba Wallace, who's an alum of our program. And I'm just so proud that perhaps we were a catalyst to bring some of his stature and his resources and to be able to garner that attention to the industry. It's amazing to me.
I want to transition back to the idea of ownership. Major news this past year because not just because of Michael Jordan's influence on this business of the sport, but like you said, his drivers are winning. Yes. I was at Bubba Wallace's win last season and interviewed him for Black Enterprise, and you see what the team is doing this year. And so this idea that in an industry where the idea of ownership, and we see it more, at least minority ownership in the major sports, and we see ownership of WNBA teams and other sports businesses that are creating opportunities and lanes for ownership. What does it mean to now, we've talked about drivers, we've talked about pit crew members, we've talked about executives, but we have high profile Black ownership. Now it takes some money, but to really say, no, we are really represented at every layer of a sport when most major sports can't really say that yet.
Yeah, it was a tough year with the litigation that transpired. However, I think I'm pretty proud of the industry coming back together and trying to grow. Reggie White, who I represented, was a named plaintiff with the NFL on free agency. Okay, and it was painful to change the economics of that industry, but I think for me, any kind of sustainable long-term relationship has to be mutually beneficial. It takes someone who is accomplished and confident and has the resources to challenge the status quo. But I think that if the economics make sense for ownership in the long run, it's good for the sport. So to have, to be living in the moment to see it, but when we look back in history on this, to have someone from our community take the leadership role on trying to change the economics and the accessibility of that sport, who's high profile and competitive as I don't know what. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Brings a whole nother level
Yeah.
of intensity.
If you're
and
racing for him, when I interviewed Bubba Wallace for Black,
Yeah.
like if you're racing for Michael Jordan,
he's not trying to
He's
come in
not-
second.
exactly.
You know what I mean? He's trying to,
Exactly.
he's trying to
Yeah,
win.
exactly.
Yes. So for me, I think that, in the long run, it's really great. But to your point, I can't think of a better global ambassador or representative of the sport that represents all that, the competitive excellence, holding people accountable, showing up all the time, making sure that people are, at the top of their game. And then now, winning. I mean, that any critic out there can't really say anything when you're the owner of an organization and your drivers are winning. You could, but I mean,
But who's going to?
Yeah, I mean, like, what
where's that going to land?
Right.
But your point about the litigation, and you could tell I'm into history in general, and history of sports. Every major sports, where you talk about the ABA NBA merger and the things that led to that the current NFL that was a merger between the AFL and NFL. And if you look at the history of that, there were prominent African Americans, athletes in particular, who were part of that narrative in one way, shape, or form. But they were part of the necessary growing pains of an evolving sport when it becomes a major industry. I fast forward to that to prepare for our conversation. I was like, let me look at some of the metrics of what it means to own a team. It's going to cost you $20 million just to get a car on the track. There's a $12 million kind of get back from being part of the NASCAR system, but that means you got to close that gap through other sources. And so it really becomes impressive, and there are several owners, obviously Michael Jordan is the most high profile one, to what it means to even be able to field a team. You talked about it earlier. You need mechanics, you need technology, you need cars, and these aren't cars off of a production line. These are amazing machines. Talk about the business model of what it means to participate in NASCAR as an owner. Where does the revenue come from? And Michael Jordan's Michael Jordan. You can say, oh, he got it, but Michael Jordan's not in it to lose money. Nobody else is in it to lose money.
Yeah, you don't want to start with to make a small fortune, you start with a big one and you lose it. You don't want to do that. Look, I can go up to the top level, or I can start even at the bottom. To your point, look, if you're trying to get into the sport, and I own a team, we had late model cars, which is a weekly local race. It costs you $250,000 per kid per car to drive that. Then you move up to the ARCA series. It's about $1 million a year to run that car. And then you got your building, your staff, your insurance, all of those kind of things. I think my wife and I, we eclipsed $8 million of our own money to bridge that gap between revenue that was coming in, that typically comes in from prize money, it comes in from sponsorship, it comes in from broadcast. There's some incremental revenue that might come in from merchandise and those kind of things. And that's, that's on a weekly basis. And so one of the things that I'm not sure that the general fan realizes is, race teams are independently owned. And the fact of the matter is that the only value that you had before this charter system came into place was your real estate and the sponsorship revenue, because the cars, we make them, we manufacture them, they get tore up, they're not worth anything. And so the only way to create enterprise value is to have this kind of franchise, and so all the litigation surrounded around, whether it's the longevity or the value of that, now you have an asset that if you win and you can invest and you build, it, that appreciates it. You can do all kinds of things, borrow money against it, leverage it. But the primary source of revenue was prize money, television, and sponsorship. And frankly, the majority was coming from your sponsor. And you got to pay your drivers well. You got to move that team around. You got to pay your salaries. And that's a daunting task. And so for me, the last 17 years, just waking up every morning, knocking on doors and trying to figure out someone who believes in both the vision, that believes in what you're trying to do, but most importantly, whether it's local or national, they want a return on that investment. If I'm going to have my name on the side of that car, what am I going to do? Your driver's going to be a brand ambassador. Am I going to be able to have hospitality? Am I going to be able to drive sales? One of the most fascinating business models that I ever saw was when I was at Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. Menards was a sponsor of ours, which for those that don't know is like Lowe's and Home Depot. And Paul Menard drove, and John Menard, his dad, is the founder, The way they leveraged it was if Peak Antifreeze wanted to be on the end cap in all the Menards stores, they were a sponsor of the race car. So they got visibility on the track. And then when the fans who were customers went in and their product was on the end, then it made business sense. So, it really takes a sophisticated marketer to figure out how to connect those dots to make things make sense. But yeah, it has been really daunting for an owner to sustain that level of competition.
So we're going to come down the home stretch of our conversation, and what's cool is that home stretch applies to both track and field and racing. But I really want to get your thoughts about the future of the business in both sports. Let's start with track and field. You've already talked a little bit about what you see the upside potential is. You see now a whole new generation of talent, young talent kids in elementary school, junior high school, who are saying, yeah, I'm the fastest, but I can be the next person and I can build a career. What do you see as the future of track and field? Let me start micro then macro. What is your future goals and direction for USA track and field, and what do you see as the future of the business of track and field?
Yeah, so you actually mentioned today, while we lose people out of the sport, you have to run, jump, and throw to be successful in any of the sports. So it's a foundational sport. It is very accessible, and has a bunch of health benefits and also character building and leadership. And so to me, at the very basic level, the more kids that we can introduce to the sport, we have a program called Run, Jump, Throw. At our youth level, we've had over 1 million kids go through it. And, that's at the elementary school level. So I think, having that infrastructure to get kids introduced to both movement and, fundamental sports and all the health benefits from it is an exciting thing for me. Connecting the dots. We sanction 6,000 events every year. We are sanctioned the New York Marathon, Boston, Chicago. People don't know those are USA Track and Field sanctioned events. Yeah, and so many of the people who participate in those events, except for the professionals, don't even know it. And so connecting, our brand and our dots with that and adding value is a goal of ours. And then we want to have literally the most dominant performance in the history of the Olympics with Los Angeles. And I think that, that athletic excellence opens up the door. People love to be associated with winners, and so for me, it attracts premium brands. It attracts, a lot of attention. And I think, technology and content production and distribution right now, it allows us to do fascinating storytelling and get it out to people in ways that 20 years ago we couldn't, and so I think that those things, participation, fan base, professionalizing, and content storytelling is where I really want to go. And I have a tremendous staff and a tremendous team that goes to work every day to make sure that happens.
So let's shift that to the same question with NASCAR. Let's start with Rev Racing, the future of Rev Racing Drive for Diversity, but the broader NASCAR opportunities. It's grown a lot, it's expanded a lot, but it's far from maxed out. So NASCAR just named Steve O'Donnell, new CEO, the first non-family member to have that role, which I think speaks a lot about the vision that goes. Yes, it was a family-based, family business, but the perception of what it can be is grown to no, we really want to expand the full business capacity, the full potential of this sport to not only entertain fans, reach new fans, but to be a major, not just national, but international sport. So what do you, again, micro, macro, Rev Racing and then NASCAR as a whole?
Yeah, as far as Rev Racing is concerned, I'm pretty proud of our body of work. I feel like we have taken Rev Racing as far as we could, and what I feel like our focus and mission on is to, again, be the catalyst to have not just one Rev Racing, but everyone committed to those principles. To see other teams committed to developing diverse talent, executive and athletes, to see our initial efforts as a catalyst become a norm in the sport. To have the grassroots start to spread and there's a pathway, and then have someone like Michael Jordan, you can aspire to be an owner like that. We tried to cover it. I was afraid, when I took over, there was one black pit crew member, Rocco. We got like 85 now that went through Rev. We had no ownership. and no drivers. And that's all I heard. We have no Raja Karuth, who drove for me, he was online. We found him, doing
simulator
and
driving.
they thought I was crazy when I said you could take a kid that's playing video games and he can be a driver. So proud of him. And so for me, I just like to continue to see this kind of catch on and spread and be multiple pathways. It does the industry, in my opinion, a disservice to have a chokehold on one pathway, right? And so I see Jason Hamilton, who applied for the program. Now he's the president of an Xfinity team, and those kind of things. So for me, my family and I are going to continue to be ambassadors of the sport, to do talent development. I'm highly focused right now on the youth space with the kids. I've launched the Rev Racing Motorsports Academy for young kids all the way up through, the college kids. And those are both athlete development, it's a business of sport, all of those kind of things. And so with that, on the global level, I think that people in other motorsport disciplines learn a lot from NASCAR. To your point, to be on the track where you could see, this is just factual, but not from any position of judgment. You could see Dale Jr., someone who didn't even graduate from high school, and the CEO of Lowe's all coming together on the track, talking about something they're passionate about. To see that kind of interaction and inspiration is fascinating. And so to see, the O'Donnells of the world focusing on international, introducing our sport around the globe is pretty exciting. So I see, the growth and the international exposure is something that is a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, and again, speaking as a newly minted fan over the last 2 years, when I was at both races when Shane Van Gisbergen won, and what struck me was the way the other drivers said his mastery of street racing in particular introduced the other drivers to a whole new techniques that's making everybody better in the sport. And you talk about people want winning, people want to see a sport improve, they want to see even greater athletic feats in every sport that says what used to be impossible is now possible. And so, again, when we talk about diversity in the broadest sense, it makes everybody better. Driver after driver after driver at the second Chicago Street Race talked about, yeah, he's tough, but he's showing us things that we didn't really know we could do with this kind of racing. Not to mention, there's a difference between racing on ovals and racing in the streets, and I think they're going to San Diego. It's really talking about this becoming a more entertaining property, entertaining experience for everybody, whether you're a driver, whether you're an executive or a professional in the business, and certainly for the fans. And if that's not what it's supposed to be all about, having fun doing what we're doing, what is it about?
Yeah. One of my closing comments is I actually have this fascinating privilege in my job at USA Track and Field to see the global cultural interaction of people. And I think the people in our sport take it for granted. Our colleagues, they're talking about their best friend, who lives in Botswana, or they talk to their friends every day that, are in Italy. These are like their colleagues and their friends. And to watch the international events and the cultural interaction and, just being exposed to broaden your vision and your horizons and appreciation of, the human experience is fascinating. One of the crazy ideas I had, one of my first sponsors I brought in, so I would have Bernard Lagat, the famous, well-accomplished distance runner who 13 medals, 8 gold. He now works on our staff. I was so tickled because I brought in Rosetta Stone because we travel around the world and they were doing culture training and people were making an effort to learn a language. To see Bernard sitting in Japan studying Spanish, to have an appreciation for the culture and to be able to communicate with his friends and colleagues as he went to compete, it was kind of game changing, right? And so you start to realize how much more we have in common globally. And so I do think the power of sport, not only from the business side, but just to really bring us together is something that's unique and special.
Max, we could do this forever.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap it up here. Thanks for being our guest
you. I
on
really appreciate
Black
it.
Enterprise.